Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this Engaging the Mind talk sponsored by Lifetime Learning. My name is Marilyn Musser, and I am an engagement associate with Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Over 625 people from 30 states and 6 countries registered for today's talk, and we are thrilled to share this event with a global audience. Today, I am pleased to introduce Lisa Reilly, who will be speaking on Notre-Dame, Rebirth or Reconstruction. Lisa is a professor in the Department of Architectural History and Joint Graduate Program in Art and Architectural History at UVA School of Architecture. She is also the director of the Undergraduate Architectural History program. Her chief research interest is the history of Norman architecture in England, France, and Italy, and her recent book, The Invention of Norman Visual Culture, Art, Politics, and Dynastic Ambition, was published in March 2020. Lisa lectures on early and later medieval architecture and has given several public interviews in the aftermath of the Notre Dame fire. We invite you to read a recent blog post that Lisa wrote about rebuilding Notre Dame on Lifetime Learning's Thoughts from the Lawn blog. Lisa is the faculty leader for the trip Egypt and the Eternal Nile in October 2021 with the Office of Engagement's Alumni and Parent Travel Program. You can find links to the blog post, the trip to Egypt, and reading materials that Lisa has suggested in today's webinar chat box.
It should just be.
Lisa will respond to a few questions after her presentation. Some of you submitted questions in advance of this program, and you may also enter a question in the webinar chat box. Please add your name and UVA affiliation to your question. This program is being recorded. And with that all said, we now welcome our speaker, Lisa Reilly.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary Lynn, for that generous introduction, and thanks to you and Althea from the Office of Engagement for giving me this opportunity to have this discussion this afternoon about Notre Dame, which has kind of re-entered the news lately because of the government decision. I'd also like to thank one of my colleagues who I think is here with us today, Kevin Murphy, who was kind enough to share the manuscript of his new book on Notre Dame in advance of this talk. It's one of the books where there's a link in chat, because you can pre-order it now and it'll be available on October 5th for purchase. So if you want to do a deeper dive, it's a great place to start. And I really appreciate his generosity with me with this. All right, what I'd like to do today is a brief overview of the fire and the damage, and then think a little bit about what to do, and think about what to do in the context of the history of Notre Dame. We think of it as an icon of Gothic architecture, but as with most things, the story is a lot more complicated than that. I think the fire was one of the most dramatic events of 2019. My phone started ringing immediately. I was sitting in my office in a meeting with one of my colleagues, and all of a sudden the phone started ringing from people wanting to know what I thought about this fire that was taking place. And I immediately logged in to see, much to my shock, Notre Dame in flames in front of me. Here's one view of the interior after the fire with some sense of the damage where the crossing, the spire came down. You can see in the nave that square, which is the intersection of the transepts and the nave with those timbers that came tumbling down in the aftermath of the fire. And Science Magazine did this brief chronology showing us the kind of time frame for this, with the fire beginning at 6:18, we think because of an electrical short. The spire, the most dramatic part of the collapse, at about 10 of 8, and the fire under control by 4 a.m. Some of you may have seen a documentary that was on TV this week that talked a lot about the firefighters. And it's only because the French fire department was so well trained and knew exactly where to go to get the treasures out of the cathedral, how to treat the building, not to spray cold water on stones or stained glass windows because of further damage, that the building wasn't more severely damaged and the loss wasn't greater. So here's some pictures of the building before on the left and after, where you can see the roof is essentially gone, with some of the scaffolding that we'll talk about that was there because the process of taking down the spire for restoration had actually begun. And then there are some views of the interior before and after the fire as well. So the question, of course, is what to do in the aftermath of this. Do we want to restore it exactly as it was, repair it, do something different? The wish to restore and repair it was virtually universal, but as we know from some of French President Macron's comments, there wasn't a kind of universal consensus necessarily about what to do in the aftermath of the fire. And throughout its long and somewhat tortured history, the questions come up several times of which cathedral to restore, what to do with this building. So what I'd like to do is give you an overview of this much beloved building's history of construction, reconstruction, repair, restoration, invention, to gain a better understanding of what building it is that actually burned, and then consider the questions of the options the French government faced, because this is a government building. In 1905, the separation of church and state in France meant that this building came under the purview of the government, and it was a government decision about the restoration. And we can consider this in part in relation to many of the quotes about how Notre-Dame's history is a history of France. Viollet-le-Duc and Baron Ferdinand de Guillermin, sorry, I'm murdering his name, in 1856 wrote, "The history of Notre-Dame is connected in an intimate manner to the entire history of France." So it's more than just a kind of simple building. It's a building with this kind of massive national identity. But before we plunge in, I'd like to ask a question. Have you ever visited Notre Dame in person? I think there'll be a poll up so you can answer this, and it'll be interesting to see how many of us have an interest in this building, because we were among the 14 million annual visitors that this building received before the fire itself. So in part, the damage also is economic in terms of the visitors who have not been able to come and see it, although also cut down by the pandemic. So, all right, and I can't see the results of the poll, but maybe I'll be able to see them later. There we go. So 80% of the people in our audience have actually visited Notre Dame before. That's a pretty good result. I've visited it too, although it's quite some time ago. And it is this kind of symbol of Paris for most of us. It's no doubt because it's such a visible part of the Paris skyline and such a popular tourist destination, as the poll suggests, that the fire attracted the international attention and the donations that it did virtually immediately. Other medieval cathedrals have caught on fire. York Minster in England, as well as Peterborough Cathedral, to name two, have caught on fire in recent years and suffered severe damage, although perhaps not as great as that at Notre Dame. And while their blazes may not have been so dramatic, I think the fact that they're not really seen as international icons of the medieval past in quite the way Notre Dame is means that interest in them was much more local and national and less international. But let's think about how this history actually begins. The arrows pointing to the Ile de la Cité, this island in the Seine on which Notre Dame is located. The Gothic cathedral stands in that part of Paris, now with great visibility from both the left and the right banks of the city. This is a part of the city that was the site of settlement in the pre-Roman period. The Romans themselves in 50 BCE established settlements in the area we now know as Paris on the left and right bank, and the Ile de la Cité, as these depictions suggest, and this kind of reconstruction on the right, served as a kind of transit point between the two banks of the Seine during the Roman occupation. And as you can see, had religious structures, a major temple of Jupiter located. So it had a kind of sacred history from its earliest time. Even before the Romans, however, there were Gallic peoples known as the Parisi who lived in this area. These are some coins of the Parisi from the 2nd century BCE. The Parisi themselves, these pre-Roman settlers, were urban dwellers. They lived in cities, and they had important trade networks as well. And they acted as intermediaries quite often between the rest of the Gauls and the conquering Romans. So there's a history even before Roman occupation on the site. Ultimately, however, it's when the Frankish king Clovis staged a successful invasion of the area and declared Paris, named for the Parisi, the capital of his new kingdom, that the kind of foundations of medieval culture in this area were laid. Under Clovis, these Merovingian rulers, as the dynasty was known, were the first post-Roman rulers of much of modern France, Belgium, and Germany. Clovis converted to Christianity in 508 and constructed several churches in the service of his new religion in Paris, establishing Paris as a major center for the Christian religion. And this is one of several reasons for the later construction of Notre-Dame Cathedral on the Ile de la Cité. Now, archaeological evidence for these Merovingian churches is limited. We know about many of these churches through some documentary records. There's limited archaeological evidence, but we do know that the most impressive and grand of these Merovingian structures actually stood on the Ile de la Cité. And this is showing a very schematic rendition of this cluster of churches that stood on the site. And you can see, hopefully, those kind of gray marks on the paper ground, which is the plan of the current Cathedral of Notre Dame. So these structures were standing on the site, and ultimately, that's where Notre Dame Cathedral was built. The churches that were put up under the Merovingians were sacked by the Normans. The people who Marilyn mentioned are much beloved to me, but were really Vikings by another name for much of their history. So this magnificent structure, the most magnificent of these Merovingian churches, was sacked by the Normans in 856, Notre Dame, on the site, but on its rebuilding on an even larger scale after the sack, it became the Cathedral of Paris. And this large church we're looking at in this cluster is a kind of schematic rendition of this church that followed the 9th century sacking. The seat of the Bishop of Paris, who will be the chief religious figure for the city, is also established at this time. And Notre Dame's a cathedral because it's the seat of a bishop. It's a particular kind of church associated with a bishop. And once Paris becomes the seat of a bishop, Notre Dame becomes his church. And so this is the moment, really, in the 9th century, when Notre Dame begins to take on preeminence in Paris, begins to become the most important church in the capital city, and supersedes the other Merovingian churches in the region. And in fact, by the 12th century, several of these other churches, some of which had been more prominent than Notre Dame earlier in their history, they are in ruins, and Notre Dame is beginning to be enlarged again, as we'll see. And you can see it here sitting towards what's the west end of the current Gothic cathedral. So beginning in the 1160s, this earlier church is replaced by the beginnings of this Gothic structure that is so much more familiar to us. The 12th century building was basically built in stages around that earlier structure that I first showed you. The earlier buildings kind of taken down in stages as the new cathedral unfolds. And it begins in the 1160s. Construction continues for a very long time, as we'll hear. And that's pretty typical of Gothic buildings, of medieval buildings, for construction to carry on for prolonged periods of time, with revisions and additions to the fabric as the design goes on. Normally in the late Middle Ages, in the Gothic period, the basic plan of the building would be laid out initially, but decisions would unfold across time as the design proceeded across time. It's not like now when you get a design from an architect and the entire thing is given to you and executed at one time. That idea of a complete design at the beginning of construction is a concept that began with Alberti in the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, we see this much more kind of organic development with the master masons understanding that construction would take a tremendously long time. So this building is beginning under the patronage of a dynasty known as the Capetians, who are become the French ruling dynasty, the kings of France. And up until this point, nobody much cared about the Capetians. In the Merovingian period, they were not really particularly powerful as the Merovingians faded away. The Capetians and the monarchy were not the most powerful people, really the dukes were. But as we move into the 12th century, the French monarchy takes on greater importance and power becomes more centralized, and they begin to patronize the construction of a cathedral church on the island, this building of Notre-Dame as the most prominent landmark. The Ile de la Cité is really the epicenter of Paris, and by about 1175, really, Notre-Dame, as we know it, had begun. And this is the plan of that building on the left. Now, as it began, you can see here that there were changes to the construction which affect its appearance. Originally, the flying buttresses protruded quite boldly from the building, and those are those black squares sticking out that I'm pointing to. However, by about the 1220s, they began to rework this plan, and you can see in the image on the right that they inserted chapels between the buttresses, basically kind of filling in those openings, and also designed facades for these transepts where some of the most magnificent rose windows are put into place. The interior elevation was also reworked. They had originally started with a 4-story elevation. They moved to a 3-story elevation with much larger clear-story windows as well. So there's this kind of long, complicated history of the building as it evolved across the Middle Ages. And we might expect it to look kind of piecemeal and disjointed at the end, but that's not really what happened. This kind of idea of a building emerging across time was really in the forefront here in the design of Notre-Dame. The plan here, you can see on the Ile de la Cité, you can get some sense of how absolutely enormous it was. And the enormous scale of the building is in part intended to assert the preeminence of Paris, the power base of the Capetian dynasty, the assertion of Paris as a capital for all of France, and then the preeminence of Notre-Dame as a church within the city of Paris itself. So it's this enormously scaled building, as you can see, and compared to the other structures around it that cluster around it on this island in the Seine River. On the interior, you can see those enormous stained glass windows. We're looking at the choir, the east end, where the altar, the important rituals would take place, the rib vaults that are so characteristic of Gothic architecture. And then on the right, we can see the flying buttresses, this kind of exoskeleton that makes the entire building possible, makes it possible for it to stand up. So it's kind of classic example of a French Gothic building from the late 12th, early 13th century with rib vaults, stained glass, large windows, flying buttresses, all the things that we think of when we think of the Gothic style. The facade on the exterior had a lavish sculpture program with sculptures over each of the doorways, as well as this band of kings of the Old Testament running just below the rose window. And then the south, north transepts, each of those had a huge stained glass window in it. You're seeing the south transept here. as did the west front of the building also. So really this enormous kind of cage of glass with this structure with these enormous interiors, spaces, huge columns, and this apparatus, these kind of buttresses that make it possible to have these enormous expanses of glass. You know, one of the things to think about is that glass was enormously expensive in the Middle Ages. Very few people had any kind of glass windows, even if you were wealthy. You would have pretty limited amounts of glass, even if you had a palace or a castle. And so when we go into these cathedrals as a medieval person, you really are going into this otherworldly space, because nowhere on earth would have this much glass, would be this large on the interior, would have this much color. So it really is kind of going into this kind of heavenly realm made possible by these buttresses that act to support the structure, so you can have these thin walls with enormous windows. So now, if we move forward, we have another poll question. So is this the building you'd like to see restored or reconstructed, this kind of late 12th and early 13th century building? But this is just one of several versions that you'll get to see today as we move through the structure. It's waiting to see what your answers will be. We'll see what comes up. You know, in the 19th century, there's a major restoration of the building that we'll see. And if that had been a less dramatic restoration, what we would see is a building that still represented these kind of multiple visions and revisions of its completed form. So we've got about 50% of people want this, 7% are saying no, and 43% are unsure. So we're pretty split. That's interesting. Good. Well, we'll see what people think, as we'll do another poll at the end as we go through this. You know, one of the things we think about with architecture is this idea that buildings have biographies, that there's not just a fixed moment where, kind of like a painting, the building's made and it never changes again. We tend to focus when we study buildings on the moment in which they're constructed and the kind of, you know, maybe 20 minutes when they're in that kind of ideal form. But in fact, buildings are living spaces, right? They're things that we use, things we occupy, and we change them in conjunction with our understanding of them, with what we want them to express symbolically, how we want them to work functionally. This is a church that's been used for hundreds of years, for centuries. Also a building with important political associations due to its patronage by the French monarchy. So the building itself kind of evolves and changes in conjunction with those ideas. So this kind of Gothic construction and conflation with the monarchy undergoes several revisions over time. So what does happen to this building that we think of as an iconic Gothic building? You know, I was looking at one of my guidebooks for Paris, and I think Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century restoration, what I'll talk about in a minute, gets, you know, about one sentence, and the rest of it waxes lyrical about the grandeur of the Gothic space, although it's been really transformed, as you'll see, since that time. But what happens is, even in the 16th century, and 17th century rather, we begin to see the building transformed. I'm showing you a picture here. You can see that furniture on the left and right of the image are the choir stalls. The building had 14th century choir stalls, its medieval choir stalls, until the time of Louis XIV. And Louis basically began a kind of updating of the building. You know, kind of like if you think about when you update your kitchen, right? Or you want to freshen it up, make it look more current. He replaces those choir stalls with a set of furnishings that are still in place today that are basically, for him, contemporary. You know, this is modern. It's kind of updating the look of his cathedral. And we're moving into a period that represents the ascendancy of neoclassicism, when people are really looking to the classical past, that is the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, as the kind of high points of civilization. The Gothic falls out of favor for a variety of reasons. The Goths are cast as the destroyers of the classical past. which is not even slightly true. And the people who are known as Goths have nothing to do with Gothic architecture whatsoever, but this kind of image of them as destroyers and destroyers of the ideal moment of the past, the classical past, comes into ascendancy in the late Renaissance period. And we begin to get this kind of modernization of the interior of the building with furniture. But in addition, Louis XV, during his reign, he scraped the decoration off the building, whitewashed it, and had all the stained glass taken out. Apart from that, in those transept windows and the west facade that I mentioned. He replaced all the rest of the windows with clear glass. He wanted a brighter, kind of more cheerful interior rather than what he saw as a kind of gloomy medieval interior with the dark stained glass that we tend to value so much today. Tombs were removed. This is in the 18th century, the stained glass being removed, and tombs are removed from the floor because usually you would want to be buried inside a church if you could afford it to make your chances of going to heaven a little greater. Those tombs with their kind of markers on the surface of the floor were taken out, and it was repaved with a blue stone to make it look more unified, more modern. A lot of the decoration was taken out of the chapels. The flying buttresses in the 18th century were also removed as they were beginning to show some signs of deterioration. They were encased in heavy masonry and kind of covered up those kind of spiky Gothic forms. And this is a painting of the interior on the left from 1709 by Jean-Baptiste Juvenet, showing a mass being celebrated at the high altar of Notre-Dame. And I'm just showing you a kind of roughly equivalent view of what it looked like before the fire. So you can see that basically the Gothic columns around the choir have been encased in this kind of neoclassical decoration and something that looks much more Roman than the actual fabric of the building. And in this view, this is a funeral procession of Philip V from 1746, also inside the Cathedral of Notre-Dame. And you can see these kind of galleries with these classicized piers placed, and up at the very top, you can see where the tracery of the Gothic windows is still visible, but it's almost as if a kind of neoclassical interior has been inserted within the building, masking the fact that France's most important cathedral, and here the site of the funeral of, an important member of the French hierarchy, Philip V, is taking place in what's made to look like a much more kind of modern neoclassical interior. And the building changes because it's a living center. It's being used all the time as a place for religious and political exhibition and display. It's all about, the kind of monarchy and keeping that building and looking like it's suitable as a setting for the kind of French monarchy and looking as up to date as possible. And so we see this incredible transformation. If the very top of the print was cut off with the tracery, it would probably be hard to convince you that this was actually an image of Notre Dame at all, given the way that it's changed. And you can see it's really changed into a kind of theater for the spectacle of the burial of Philip V with this very neoclassical vocabulary during the Enlightenment in 1746, when interest and kind of passion for neoclassicism is at a high point. And French architectural education through the École des Beaux-Arts and the French Academy is also very tied to using neoclassicism, using the classical past as a model. And so all of this plays into this kind of adaptation and reinvention of Notre Dame as this modern neoclassical structure so that the monarchy can look current and up to date within the space. So it is very much associated with the monarchy and is very much associated in a moment with the neoclassical past, but the monarchy is its closest association. And these dates I've been talking about, 1746 for this funeral, is not so far away from the French Revolution in 1789. And so the cathedral comes to represent a France that revolutionaries in the late 18th century want no part of, right? They don't want any part of this kind of Catholic state religion, which is firmly tied to the French monarchy they're trying to shed France of. They want a new France with no monarchy, no Catholic Church, the kind of prominent images of that past, they want them all removed and destroyed. They even invent a new calendar to kind of get rid of all these hints of the past. And so this connection with the church and the nobility of France make it a target of revolutionaries in 1789 and the years that come after that. On November 2nd, 1789, church property is nationalized and the removal of royal and religious symbolism from public property is actually mandated. So we can see in this image from that period of time, the spire, which is so famous now, is no longer apparent. There was a spire put up in the medieval period, but it is taken down, in part, some say, for structural reasons, in 1792. The interior of the building is emptied out at night in a kind of nighttime raid, supposedly in 1792, and the building's rededicated not as a church, but as a temple of reason, emphasizing the kind of rationalism of the Enlightenment, and that as an outlook rather than the kind of Christian religion of Catholicism that dominated French government before. So we have the spires actually removed, and official directives came forward mandating further destruction and removal of decoration from this and other buildings. Now, this is the facade on the left of the building as it exists now. You can see this kind of lavish sculptural program. You can see the column here in between the doors. That had been taken out earlier on in order to make the door more suitable for processions. And some of the sculpture here has been removed to give it more height. But now we can also see that these figures, those kings I mentioned earlier on, who are actually Old Testament kings, are removed. Originally, the directive said that the crowns had to be removed from these figures, the 28 figures of the kings of Judea and Israel from the West Front. There seems to have been some confusion over who these kings were. Many people at the time thought that they were actually French kings. So the idea was that the crowns would be removed, that symbol of royalty. And you can see here the kind of difference when the spire was still in position, the kings in position, and that full sculpture on the second, the central portal, and then how that changed during the revolution and in the years leading up to it. But the Gallery of Kings came in for even greater destruction than simply removing their crowns. On the 23rd of October in 1793, the Council of the City of Paris ordered that due to its obligation to vanquish all monuments that feed religious prejudices and those that recall the execrable memory of kings, orders that within a week, the Gothic simulacra of the kings of France that are placed above the portal of the Church of Notre-Dame be removed and destroyed. And you can see those figures where they originally were. And what we're seeing on the right is an excavation in 1977 found the heads of these statues. And in fact, the statues seem to have been beheaded, kind of emulating the kind of fate that French nobility was facing during the revolution in real time, acting that upon these kings who were not actually French kings at all, but they seem to have forgotten that. And 21 of the original 28 heads were recovered in these excavations in 1977, kind of playing out this kind of reaction against monarchy, both in kind of real and material ways with this treatment of these sculptures from the Gallery of Kings. Now, following the revolution, there is a return to a kind of monarchy. under Napoleon the First. And this is an image of the coronation of Napoleon from 1805 to 1807. In that interior, which is still essentially a neoclassical space, as you can see. Napoleon, he realized the value of Notre-Dame in terms of its meaning as well. But Napoleon wasn't trying to react or eradicate the memory of the monarchy, but rather make a connection to it, make himself look like a legitimate ruler by connecting to the monarchical past of the pre-revolutionary period. So he has himself crowned emperor at Notre-Dame, as depicted here in 1804. He has emblems, little N's are put on the building and other emblems associated with him. Apparently he wanted a statue of himself put on the front of the building, showing him as a kind of hero, because he also does establish a repair fund for some restoration of the building. The building's actually in pretty bad shape, and not just because of the revolution. There's a lot of deferred maintenance going on here. And so he establishes a modest annual fund for maintenance. There had been one before, but it was canceled during the revolution. But he understood, just as the revolutionary government before him did, that France's medieval churches and cathedrals were an emblem of its history. And in his case, he wants to connect to that history. In the revolution's case, they want to overturn that history. So what happens and continues to change over time is we have this Notre-Dame of a particular moment, whether it's being turned into a temple of reason to celebrate the revolution's complete revision of France into a non-monarchical, non-Catholic state, or whether it's the French monarchy, whether the kind of Bourbon monarchy or Napoleon kind of inventing himself as a monarch, also capturing that sense of Notre-Dame as this important center for the nation and its identities. So, politics had a very immediate impact on how people saw Notre-Dame, as the building carried such clear associations with the church and state. Napoleon's trying to reconnect to that pre-revolutionary past. So he has particular things he wants the building to say, and he wants it to say them in association with him. But then we have this kind of period of upheaval again. Napoleon falls from power, and we have other people coming to the fore. And as we move more towards the center of the 19th century, we begin to get this interest in these medieval monuments and understanding them as actually worthwhile in and of themselves, that they're moment of greatness, and in some ways France's moment of greatness was during the Gothic period, that the kind of fabric of Notre-Dame before all the neoclassical insertions really represented. The Commission des Monuments Historiques, the Commission of Historic Monuments, is founded early in the July monarchy. It's soon headed by Prosper Mérimée. And this ushers in a new era in historic preservation, where he closely works with Viollet-le-Duc on the left-hand side in restoring many of France's most canonical medieval monuments during this period. And people begin to become passionate about having the Gothic recovered, the medieval recovered as this kind of true French style, and replacing these neoclassical kind of counterparts that were inserted here. And as the use of the building increased again during the July monarchy, its poor condition became more obvious. And there is a competition, this is a pretty condensed version of this history, but a competition's actually held for hiring the people who will be put in charge of the restoration of Notre-Dame in the 1840s. Normally these were through appointments, but this time it was a competition. And Viollet-le-Duc and his collaborator, shown on the right, Jean-Baptiste Lassus, win this very important position of restoration architect for Notre Dame, because this kind of architectural production is tied to the government in France. This is a government building, a government commission that's then commissioning people to restore these structures. And in a sense, what they want to do is create a building that never actually existed at Notre Dame, but one which represents this kind of high point of the French past in terms of its medieval architecture. Reilly did take a role in restoring Notre Dame as a religious center, as a place where church services were held and are still held and will be held as the cathedral reopens after the fire. But more important to him was really the identity of Notre Dame and other medieval buildings as an image of this Gothic period of ascendancy for France, and as a testament to the architectural genius of the French. So it's kind of almost like secular identity as a national emblem, separate from its religious function, is what was really important to him. The definitive 19th century form that the cathedral took on is based on some evidence of the building itself, but also on their vision, Lassus and Reilly's vision of what a Gothic cathedral should look like, regardless of what it may have looked like when it was completed, but what this kind of ideal Gothic building should appear to be. And in his dictionary that he wrote, his famous dictionary about architecture, under the term restoration, Reilly said, quote, "To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to establish it in a finished state, which may in fact have never actually existed at any time." So to kind of achieve this idealized form of the completed building in a way. So he's claiming authority for this vision of a historical building and his imagined completeness. And this is what permeates this restoration that goes on between the 1840s and the 1860s. And he's not the only one that thinks this way. In England, we see buildings that don't have flying buttresses. The restoration architect would decide that the architect meant to put the flying buttresses, but forgot or didn't get around to it. So they add them in the 19th century. So this kind of concept of an ideal form, and it's the restoration architect's job to achieve that, is not unusual at this time. Now, what are some of the things that they want to do during this period? Well, on the one hand, there are lots of buildings around Notre Dame. There are lots of other structures clustered up around it. This is very typical of French cathedrals. Those of you who have been to England have seen how often, like if you've been to Salisbury, English cathedrals tend to stand in a large open ground, so surrounded by green space. So you get these magnificent vistas, and then you can have fabulous paintings of buildings like Salisbury Cathedral. But in France, they tend to be clustered with lots of structures above them. And you can see here in this print, Notre Dame is rising up above all the other kind of roofs and buildings around it. But this new concept of restoration meant that these buildings should stand as kind of icons that are easily visible and freed from all these other structures around it. So I'm just showing you this plan here where you can see Notre Dame surrounded by these other structures as it originally was. And here's a view of some of them being taken down with Notre Dame at the end of the street there. And then this view on the left as it begins to be free. They wanted to have a view, a kind of constructed view from both the left and right banks of the river. So you can see this magnificent icon of the French Gothic in this kind of isolated way. They want the island, the Ile de la Cité, to actually become a kind of promenade, a kind of pleasure ground, and clear out that bishop's palace that's kind of cluttering it nearby, so that you can kind of stroll and perambulate as the bourgeoisie and leisure time becomes more prominent in 19th century France, and enjoy the building. Now at the time, not everybody liked it. Some thought it looked like a great elephant in the middle of a desert cleared out like this, but it became enormously popular, as we know, for the subject of paintings as well as photographs like these, where you get these incredible views of the facade and the entire building overall. Now on the interior, He also, Reilly, found evidence of that earlier 4-story elevation that had been part of the initial cathedral that was then replaced by the one you can see here on the right with the larger clear story. And he went back, and put in these oculuses of the structure here. Let me see if I can get back to that. Whoop. There we go. Put in these round windows in the elevation. The debate about the archaeological evidence for those has gone on. Some of the things he did, we think were accurate, some not so accurate, but you can see he has this kind of multiple history being displayed in the building. He also did designs to replace the clear glass with stained glass and replace the other decorations of the building, as you can see in these wonderful drawings here that were part of the advertisement. And then he also most famously added these things, often called gargoyles, although they're not true gargoyles, to the exterior of the building, these kind of chimera, these kind of grotesque figures. One medievalist, Michael Camille, has kind of talked about these as representing Reilly's reaction to the revolution and kind of trying to scare people off. It's also described that cholera, which convulsed France in the mid-19th century, may have given him the basis for these deformed and twisted gargoyles along the roof. Apparently, as the restoration of Notre-Dame was going on from the 1840s to 60s, that enormous parvis, that kind of paved area in front of it, was actually converted into an open-air clinic and morgue for the epidemics, dead and dying. And seeing that, some people think may have given him the idea for these that are among the most popular and famous elements of the building, but are all firmly 19th century. Now the spire, his drawing for that is on the left, and we can see his spire about to collapse in the image from the right. It's believed to date from around 1250. It was blown down in 1606, but put back. But he felt very strongly, it had been taken down during the revolution, but this is one of the things that Reilly felt the most strongly about, was restoring the spire. And the new spire is actually inaugurated in 1859. The superstructure, it's an oak structure resting on 4 piers, or was sheathed in lead with a number of decorative elements, including these statues along the base. He also restored the facade and was instructed to put the Gallery of Kings back into the building, to repopulate that and eliminate the traces of mutilation from the Gothic period. Some people were thrilled to have it back. Others thought that the history of the building, in terms of its history of damage and destruction, should be left. One person wrote that restoration means a symbolic destruction of royal and ecclesiastical symbols, including Notre Dame, will have been for naught, and said, vainly will history have based over the buildings. Vainly will the revolution coming into their sanctuaries like the angel of death have extinguished their candles with its wings and melted their reliquaries. So not everybody was happy with this idea of this kind of invented medieval idealized past for the structure. So one last poll question before we quickly look at a couple of pictures of the restoration. Do you think it should be restored to its condition at the time of the fire, which is largely its condition under Reilly's restoration? This is essentially the building that burned down. Now, while you're filling that out, because we only have a little bit of time left here, just want to show you some of the restoration ideas. So we've got 62% in favor of having Reilly's building back, which is in fact what the French government has decided to do. A little bit more decisive here about the medieval one. Now Macron started off talking about how there'd be this modern building, and perhaps some of you think, given the history of the building and how it's always been tied into reflecting its own time, that's what should be done. And this is just one of the reconstruction ideas. One was to put a swimming pool on the roof. This one has a glass structure. Foreign Affairs, the magazine Foreign Affairs in August wrote, "What has consensus ever done to keep culture alive?" Suggesting that maybe consensus is not the way to go with this kind of decision that the French government has made. And let me just show you, this is the building after the fire, because part of what they had to do was, this is the spire, and this is actually one of the figures from the spire which were being taken down at the time of the fire, which is a portrait of Reilly as the Apostle St. Thomas. And here they are being removed just before the fire, but that meant that all the scaffolding was up there. And that's been part of the struggle, is to get the scaffolding down, which is kind of melded. And you can see here, people are basically belaying to get down from this. And then a rolling platform's been constructed to move across without damaging the vaults further to facilitate that. Because basically what has to be done is a process of stabilization for the structure, decontamination because of the lead, which many of you asked about and we can talk about, and then reconstruction. So those kind of three phases, which the French government is still saying will be done in time for the 2024 Olympics, but not many experts believe that. These are the timbers afterwards. And I just want to show you, this is the stained glass windows, which were contaminated by the lead, being cleaned off. First of all, they found using baby wipes was the best way to get the lead contamination off the structure of the building. And basically this restoration, as the French government wants to conduct it, is possible in large part because of the work of my late colleague, Andrew Tallon, who died quite young, but did this scan that kept coming up in the news of the building. That means we can replicate what was there, that your wish to have the building that stood before the fire is really possible in a way that it was never possible before. The one change that's planned is Macron has called for a modern reimagination of the parvis in front of the cathedral. So perhaps this is where he'll get his kind of modern new France represented. But overall, this kind of romantic, dramatic image of the medieval past is what's going to be restored, with Reilly's spire crowning it by the French government. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, Lisa, thank you for sharing an informative and engaging presentation on Notre-Dame Cathedral. And for our audience, please remember to check the resources that we have shared in the chat. All right, Lisa, are you ready for a few?
Sure.
Okay, so Don Greenwood of Vienna, Virginia would like to know if you favor restoring the cathedral to its pre-19th century appearance, even though most people are more familiar with the changes made to its medieval originality. And also a second question from him, you had mentioned that 14 million visitors per year have visited Notre Dame. And do you think the fire or reconstruction will have any effect on tourism?
Like, will fewer people come to visit once it's
fewer or more? Do you think it could be fewer or more people?
Well, I think once the pandemic's over, it could be more people who'll be interested to see what's going on. It attracted so much attention that I think even more people will want to go and see it and see what's up with the process. You know, part of what I didn't talk about is the kind of potential silver lining of this situation is that we are getting a lot of information about how the building was built and that whole process. And I think some of those fragments will be on display ultimately as part of this. But the first part of his question had to do with what I think they should do.
Yes,
right?
Your opinion, yes.
My opinion on what should be done. That's a tough one. You know, there's a part of me that was like, oh, let's just put a swimming pool on the roof of the building. But actually, as several people point out, the problem with the proposals that were put out, which weren't really done seriously, the competition was never launched, was that none of them really addressed the building in any kind of significant way. And so they really had nothing to do with the structure at all. And so there could be kind of modern things done that were actually a little bit more relevant for the building itself, but that's not what happened. But I think restoring it to its medieval fabric, I think that's pretty unlikely. And I think there's something about Violet's work and evoking that 19th century romantic vision that's important to keep. So I guess, yeah, but I'll be eager to see what they do with that area in front, what they come up with.
Okay, great, thanks. We have a question here from David Miller of Camden, Maine. And while visiting Paris, so if someone were to go to Paris, how can one best find a source to appreciate the past significance of Notre-Dame to the city? As the de facto center of the city's beginnings, it would be wonderful to track the historical significance of the building and to contemplate whether it is now more of a museum than it is a religious institute. So if they go to Paris, what can they find?
What can they find, or what should they read?
What should they, what is a good source to appreciate it, either preparing beforehand or while they're there?
Well, I do actually think that Kevin's book that I put in the chat is the best thing to read, because he does cover in much more detail, obviously, than I did, from the early history of the site up to the present. The problem with his histories of Notre Dame, I find, is it's a really complicated building with a kind of tortured history. And medievalists tend not to work on it very much because they don't think of it as a really medieval building, and then 19th century people might not necessarily work on it because, you know, the same way. So until Kevin wrote his book, I really felt like there wasn't a kind of clear book you could read about it. There is Alain Erland Brandenburg has written about it. I'm not sure it's something you'd want to read if you didn't have to, because it's pretty complicated. And then there's another book. I have another book behind me that I'm just reaching for so I can look at the author. Alan Timko's Notre Dame de Paris. But these are pretty specialized. The other book I put up is by Andrew Tallon, by Notre Dame, that is really just mainly about the medieval history. It doesn't tell you the full story the way Kevin's book does, but he's the person who did the scanning, and he does it has some of the later stuff as well. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Brian Kirk would like to know if you can comment at all on the grand organ restoration.
I can't. Sorry, okay. Brian. I do know that Ville was involved and built something to do with the organ, but I'm afraid I don't know anything about the organ restoration.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. What about the cost? We have Jean Band from Annapolis, Maryland, asking about what the estimated cost and duration of construction might be. Is it in the millions or maybe up to $1 billion?
Well, what I read this morning was that it was $1 billion they were estimating. And as I said, the official statement, most recent one I read, still said 2024, which, you know, the French are really fixated. Well, Macron's really fixated on that date because that's the year Paris is due to host the Olympics. But I think that it's possible that the building will be open and something will be done by then. I don't think they'll be finished by that date, is what I would say. Okay, I don't think they'll be finished by that date.
And Lisa, we have time for one last question from Kelly O'Meara.
Kelly, hi.
She wants to know how the rose windows fared during the fire.
How the rose window, Kelly's a he. The glass, okay, so I showed that picture with the contamination. One of the things that was so impressive about the training of the firefighters was that they had specifically been trained not to spray cold water on the glass because it would make it shatter once it had started to heat up. You know, you might think, oh, you want to put the fire out, but if that cold water hit the glass, it would shatter. So the glass is intact. I have been told by one of my colleagues in England who heads up another one of the major glass restoration establishments that in some of the rose windows, there are multiple tiny fractures that are going to have to be repaired, but that the glass is largely as an ensemble intact, is what she told me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, there are a few more questions that we weren't able to answer, and I want you to know that in the chat, everyone is pleased that you are speaking to them. They feel like this is a very personal experience, so we appreciate you setting aside time for this semester's, from your semester's unusual teaching schedule to enlighten us on this historic, world-renowned cathedral.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next Lifetime Learning program is Tuesday, September 29th at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Co-sponsored by Morven Farm and the Virginia Farm Bureau, a panel of experts will discuss From Farm to Plate, the impact of COVID-19 on food, nutrition, and farming. Lifetime Learning's next More Than the Score series talk is on Friday, October 2nd at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Women in Politics, Past, Present, and Future. You can check out the full list of autumn Lifetime Learning programs and register on our website at alumni.virginia.edu/learn. And you will also find a recording of this program on the Lifetime Learning website. And I believe the information about that is in the chat. So thank you again, our global watchers, and until we meet again, be safe, be engaged, and wahoo wah.